Thank you very much, Claudia, for the kind words. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to this group. And all of you for taking some time off your day today, braving the elements to come out today. I have the dubious distinction of talking about quite a heady subject, and I hope I can do it some justice. This is a bit of a departure for me in terms of my topics and presentations. I typically talk about water and Water Act and wetlands, but I want to do something a little bit different today. A little bit very exciting stuff, and I wanted to kind of give some history in why we do what we do. So if someone on the street asked me what I did and asked me about water in Alberta, of course, there's two questions you're going to get whenever I go somewhere and give a lake presentation. I give a lot of lake presentations. Number one question you're going to get is, can I drink the water? And of course, with this new raw water fad, sure, go ahead and drink the water. We've got this new raw water fad, it's really great. And the other thing is, can I eat the fish? I'm going to get those two questions. So those are the two things I always prepare for before I go to a Lackland Hunt or a Red Deer somewhere like that. But the story of water in Alberta is focused on quantity in the past. So the last 100 years, we have built this province talking about water quantity, water flows. But now we're just starting to begin to understand water quality. The story of water quality in Alberta is about the loss of wetlands, the release of phosphorus, and the mobilization of sediment. It's a story of non-point source pollution and the failure to understand and properly value ecological goods and services. So if you've ever heard me talk, I came to this university 25 years ago. It's just kind of a big surprise to be back in this room. It was 25 years ago. My office was actually at the top of that building right there. I was on the 7th floor of the botany wing, fresh-faced grad student 25 years ago, studying wetlands and phosphorus with Dr. Suzanne Bailey here at the university, with Dave Schindler over in the other tower there, who was my idol, and listening to him talk about lakes and phosphorus. So it was really a great nexus for me to be in this place. So it's fun to be invited back to here. But you'll hear me talk about wetlands. You'll hear me talk about phosphorus. You'll hear me talk about sediment. Why? Water quality is all linked in Alberta to phosphorus. So we have water quality problems with algal blooms, with turbid water, those sort of things. It all comes down to phosphorus, and of course sediment are the little fine particles that phosphorus hitches its wagons to and gets a ride through rivers, through ecosystems. And typically we have wetlands and riparian areas on the landscape that are to intercept that sediment and to grab onto it and to have plants strip out the phosphorus. But when we degrade those riparian areas, when we drain those wetlands, that sediment-laden, phosphorus-laden water makes itself into a lake or a wetland. And of course, that's when we start to have degraded water quality and all sorts of other problems associated with that. Now, if I go up to the 1,000-foot level, we want to talk about water and planning. One of the questions Claudia tasked me with is, how does water intercept the planning world? I'd have to say, number one, climate change and how the rules have changed. We used to be happy with dealing with 1 in 100-year floods. Wasn't that fun? And then when you get 3 1 in 100 events, 3 1 in 100 flood events in a 10-year period, we start to wonder, have we got that figured out? Well, no. Climate change has changed a lot of things, and it's really impacted the water file. So people who deal with especially water quantity, this is a huge, huge issue, the timing of flows and floods and that sort of thing. So there's people that just deal with predicting water flows in this province to make sure that we meet our apportionment agreements with the other provinces around us. Climate change has changed the rules. I was told it was a real simple task to manage water in Alberta. It's real simple, Jay. Real simple. We just got to remember two things. We just have to manage for drought and for floods. And once we got that all figured, that was a joke, people. This is a tough crowd. Thank you. Loosen me up a little bit. I need some laughs. All you need to do is be able to manage for drought and floods. And I want to point that out because I think it's funny. Because in the first part of my water career, whenever we're in a dry period, we just deal with drought. And then suddenly we get a flood and we turn all of our attention to just dealing with floods. And I think we've woken up to the fact that we need to be dealing with both of those all of the time. So we can't just have the blinders on because it's been dry for the last 10 years. So it's been funny. Through the 90s as I moved out to Alberta, and then into the 2000s, it was just drought, and fires. And of course now we've completely hitched it to floods since the Calgary floods in 2013. So it's interesting, but I think water planners now are dealing with both. You've got the Municipal Government Act that squarely deals with how planners do their business on a day-to-day basis. And then in my world, we've got the land use framework, we've got regional plans, and of course you've got changes to the MGA as well. Following those floods in Calgary, we've got Bill 27, so how development on floodplains affects where we can develop, and I can talk about the flooding pieces because we're now actually controlling where we can and can't develop, and of course we're not supposed to develop on the floodway anymore. And of course we talk about Dutch programs like Room for the River, stepping back from the water, ensuring that we have not just healthy functional riparian areas, but also making sure that we have room for the river when it needs to overtop its banks, and we have these big floods so that we're not flooding out million-dollar properties in Calgary, we're flooding out soccer fields, hayed lands, lower valued lands instead of impacting infrastructure. Of course, on the planning side, one of the things I deal with as a biologist is biophysical impact assessments. So before any development goes into place, we have to do a biophysical impact assessment. And one would think that there's some clear rules on how to do a BIA. And of course, if you work for the City of Calgary, you work for Rocky View County, there's a really great recipe as to what goes into a biophysical impact assessment. But my phone has rang before, and not to call out Cold Lake or anything, but my phone has rang before by someone who's planning a development in, say, Cold Lake, and they'll say, okay, we need you to do a biophysical impact assessment that we can put before the council in Cold Lake. So I'll phone up Town of Cold Lake and I'll say, so what are your biophysical impact assessment requirements? And they say, you're the smart guy, you figure it out. You know, do I put in wetlands? Do I put in birds? Do I put in raptor nests? What do I put into that biophysical impact assessment? Who figures all that stuff out? And that's a whole other talk I could give to this group because I really love what Rocky View and the City of Calgary has done because they've got very straight requirements for what goes into a BIA and why and what the triggers are for a much more deeper look. Of course, we've got the subdivision appeal boards, and I've got some experts in the room here, so I've got to be careful what I say around that. But of course, the subdivision appeal board is another place as a biologist that I've appeared to go and talk about wetlands, to go and talk about water. And of course, we've got the watershed resilience program that the province has, and that is a program that municipalities can apply for dollars for and get into doing some of this drought and flood planning. So the WRRP program is someplace else. I encourage you to have a look. So the history of water management in Alberta, I'm going to try and do this justice. I've never done this before, so I'm going to try and do this some justice. But to understand where we are and how did we get here, because I could start talking to you about FITFR and all that kind of stuff, and you wonder, how the hell did we get there? Why are we dealing with these 100-year-old plus apportionment agreements? Why am I stuck to having to manage the Calgary area and somebody sitting over here with 80% of the water in the Bow River with a 100-year-old license that I'll never ever be able to touch? Well, how did we get there? Well, you got to think back to what Alberta looked like 100 years ago, 100 years plus. So in 1870, Canada takes the Hudson's Bay Corporation territory. So back at that time, it's the gray piece here. The Hudson's Bay Company owned all of this Rupert's land, right? So the company of explorers had surveyed all of this, and they owned all of Rupert's land. And you can see where I'm going here. Alberta fits right in there. So Canada knew that the Hudson's Bay Corporation lease on this land would be given up in 1870. So in 1870, they took it all over and heavily began marketing the area and selling the land. CP Rail, of course, was just completed through this area. And we wanted to get this land settled. We wanted to get farmers in the arable land down here. So how do we do that? Well, we had unprecedented growth in the West. We were encouraging people, we were giving away land. We were giving away water rights, right? So 1896 to 1914, we had unprecedented growth in the prairies. This is Saskatchewan and Alberta. Unprecedented growth. Most of these are very knowledgeable Mormon farmers. Mormon farmers that are really knowledgeable about irrigation practices. So we're giving away free land, we're giving away free water, and of course you're able to use the riparian rights of that water. So this worked out really well. So in 1882, the province of Alberta was still a district of the Northwest Territories, and water use was dictated by what was known as riparian rights. So if you own a piece of land that butts up against the Bow River, you are able to use as much water as you want to use because you have the riparian rights to that water. So those rights give any landowner whose property is adjacent to it the right to make reasonable use of it. So railway development occurs. We have this huge explosion of growth and settlers. We got no more land to give away because there's no more plots that are by these rivers, but we've still got still have lots more land to give away around these areas. So how are we going to continue to give away that water? Because I can't run across your land to access the water. That's not fair. So how are we going to do this? So in 1894, the Dominion of Canada passed the Northwest Irrigation Act, which allowed allocation of water by the government for irrigation and other purposes. So now we start building all sorts of pipelines and infrastructure so we can start moving water around. So everyone knows in this room that we irrigate hundreds of thousands of kilometers of pipes in the south and trenches in the south for irrigation, right? I should have put that map into this talk. But so we've spent all this time and money allocating the water so that we can get water from, this is the St. Mary's Dam going in 1908. And of course you've all driven past the Western Headworks Canal right in the middle of the city of Calgary, that great big, and it's just the goofiest looking thing now because they created Hardy Passage and then they created some other stuff and then they needed to make it canoe friendly, but that's where half of the water of the boat comes out, right there in the middle of downtown. Half of the water of the boat comes out there and goes to the Western Irrigation District, goes to Chestermere Lake, and it goes to Gleason and Rockyford and all of these other towns so they get their drinking water from it, and as well we're essentially irrigating a desert in the south. So that's how we've been moving water around. So the Northwest Irrigation Act, here's the neat part about the Northwest Irrigation Act in 1894. It unequivocally revoked or rescinded the common law riparian rights. And it declared that all water in all streams, lakes, ponds, springs, or other sources now belongs to the Crown. So in 1894, people don't own water anymore. The Crown owns all the water. But the feds grant water rights or concessions to companies or other individuals for a variety of uses. So in this powerful piece of legislation are clear principles and very enforceable regulations, unlike in the States, because that meant there was little litigation here in Alberta from this legislation, because it was just very well written and very enforceable. Of course, there was riots and all sorts of things in the United States when this happened. However, the Northwest Irrigation Act failed to consider other options that were available to government once river basins reached the point of full allocation. And of course, we reached that allocation in 2009 in the Bow River. Basically, we woke up one morning and we realized that we've given away more water licenses than there was actually water in the river. And that's a problem. The other problem with the Northwest Irrigation Act is that it failed to grant licenses with a fixed date. So I had the privilege recently of being down at the Eastern Irrigation District, and Earl Wilson was giving me a tour, and on the wall is their water license from 1896, hanging up on the wall. So that is a senior license, and so they have the highest priority of all water users in all of the Bow, and when they say, I want all my water, they can take all their water. Because we manage water on a system called first in time, first in right. And you'll find this in a variety of places around the world. So that gives the seniority of the license priority. So, Earl Wilson and the Eastern Irrigation District get their water first, the Western Irrigation District gets their water second, the other irrigation districts get their water, and then all of the other people who have applied for water licenses through the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s all come next. Those are called junior priority licenses. And FITFR, to this day, continues to be the system for water allocation under the Water Act. Well, you can imagine now, we've given away all the water in the Bow. How the heck are we going to continue to give out water? Then we've got this other piece of legislation called the Transfer of Natural Resources Act. And of course, Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't even become provinces until 1905. And we needed a federal irrigation act that granted the new provinces some very limited local powers, but left the regulation of water resources in federal hands. Remember, it's owned by the Crown, so it's managed by the Crown. So the Transfer of Natural Resources Act of 1930 transferred control of natural resources to Alberta and Saskatchewan, but it maintained and retained control of our water resources. So of course, the province of Alberta put out its first Water Resources Act of 1931, and primarily that is the tool that said how we were going to continue to allocate and divert water. And of course, that Water Resources Act did not address water quality issues. We didn't know what phosphorus was back then, or why phosphorus was important. It wasn't until Dave Schindler did all that great work at ELA in the late 60s and early 70s that we realized phosphorus was even a pollutant. And I'll talk about phosphorus as a pollutant in a moment. Ownership of water is still vested in the Crown, and of course that Water Resources Act was updated to become our modern Water Act in 1999. So this blows my mind a little bit, but that's exciting. So from that period of 1930 to say to 1970, we had looming water supply shortages due to full allocation, and we were fully in the dam building era. That was the golden age of the water resources engineers and those guys that loved to build dams. 1930 to 1970. It had ended, and so the Bow River, for instance, has 12 dams on it. Does that boggle the mind? The Bow River has 12 dams on it. Even the North Saskatchewan River, our North Saskatchewan River, right out the door, right over there. 2 dams on the North Saskatchewan River. But even the Peace has a dam on it. The Athabasca has a dam on it. So fish, these are very controversial, especially as we started getting into the environmental issues of the 1980s and 1990s. So even the latest couple of dams that we did in the province, there was huge environmental backlash. So not just environmental, but other concerns. But fish passage, sediment loading, timing of flows, evaporation, and of course the rest of the world, they're decommissioning dams in the rest of the world. We're daylighting streams, we're decommissioning dams, we're doing those sort of things. So we've gone past that golden era of dam building and trying to make up for a shortage of water now we have to do something different. So where are we going now? What are we doing now? Well, the past has been a focus on infrastructure and resource allocation, with one ministry with primary responsibility, with most of the investment going towards developing infrastructure, so building dams, building great big, well now it's pipelines, but a lot of them were just above ground canals. Hundreds of kilometers of canals in the southern part of the province. And I'm sure you've seen them as you've driven anywhere south or east of Calgary. It was a rules-based approach. There was a dependence on regulatory tools, and the government's role was the resource manager. They had the final say. Nobody else got to play in their sandbox. They were the resource manager. Whereas we move into the new era of 1999 and beyond, we're getting into how the province is going to manage that water. We're getting more into conservation and management of water. We want to promote economic growth and prosperity while protecting existing rights. But now the focus is on managing and protecting our water resources, talking about quantity and quality. And the province, this Water Act now governs the diversion and the allocation and the wise use of water. So that's the first time you see that wise use statement, which is very interesting. So some of you might say, well, geez, all the water's in the north, all the people are in the south. Why don't we just pipe all the water from the Peace River down to the Bow? And we explored that. We looked into that. Yeah, we did. That was a huge focus. I was at a water conference in the last 10 years and people talked about doing things like that. But we're not in that era anymore. We've gotten out of that infrastructure, the dams era. We've gotten out of the pipe dream era of moving water around. And now we are managing within the capacity of watersheds. So in my short career doing water work, we've really gotten into what is a watershed, how do we manage within the watershed itself. So that's why we've got these regional plans that talk about the Bow, the South Saskatchewan, the Athabasca, the Peace, because we're managing within the capacity of those watersheds now. We're not going to try and jettison in water from the moon to try and solve our water shortage problems. We have to deal with it at the local level. So that's where we're at in terms of our thinking now. So the Water Act does maintain that priority system of water allocation, first in time, first in right. Now I should say, other countries, like Australia, got rid of first in time, first in right. They tore up all their old agreements and said, we're going to start all over from right now. And we're going to start a whole new way of allocating water. I'm not going to get into what they did, but that has been talked about in Alberta. But we currently exist, those water licenses are in good standing. We also protect our traditional agricultural uses of water, because basically if your land butts onto some water, you're allowed to get a certain amount for free, and that's a freebie under the Water Act. The Water Act also set a requirement for a provincial water management planning framework, which we're well into these days under Water for Life and under our regional plans. It allows for the transfer of an allocation of water under a license. So now if I want to set up shop in Calgary, I can't, since the basin is now closed, right? 2009, we realized the South Saskatchewan Basin was over-allocated, so it's been closed to any surface water licenses. So now if I want to buy some water for Calgary, I've got to buy it off somebody else who's got a license, preferably somebody with a senior license. I don't want no junior licenses, right? I want a senior license. So that is where the Cross Iron Mills Mall got into the whole issue with water in Balzac, and the Western Irrigation District ended up buying some water from the Western Irrigation District. And that's how that problem of water got sold. So we're in this market now. We have a water market in the south. So license holders are able to switch licenses and sell portions of their license that they're not using. So we've got a water market in the south, which is very interesting. That will happen one day in this basin, in the North Saskatchewan Basin. We still prohibit the export of water to the United States, bulk water, and it prohibits any major interbasin transfers between Alberta's major river basins, unless specifically authorized by the legislature. So that's why we're not moving water from the Peace down to the Bow. That's why we're not moving water out of the North Saskatchewan River to fix the water quality problems at Pigeon Lake. Right? Because there's people that want to do that. There's people that want to do that right now. Now, what's really cool about the water, so that's the history of it all. Now I can kind of get into the meat of my talk, the water of my talk. The Water Act defines what water and what a water body is. And literally, I can go outside. Well, actually, we got a lot of water on the ground outside right now. So that's all the water body out there with all that snow on it. Quite literally, I can go and pour this outside on the ground, and that becomes a water body under the Water Act. It regulates and enforces on actions that affect water and water use management, the aquatic environment, fish habitat protection practices, and stormwater management. So essentially, if I am doing anything in this province, and I'm going to be crossing water, in water, doing works in and around water, transportation projects, digging, if I'm hitting or working around water or potentially having an impact on water with sediment or anything else, I need to get a Water Act approval, or I need to at least consider the Water Act and see what it says for my business. Maybe it's just a code of practice notification. Maybe there's some other mechanism. But typically, folks need to get a Water Act approval for their works in building a bridge. Like there's a great big bridge we just took the bridge out actually. The North Saskatchewan River. So those folks had a giant Water Act license to do that activity, and of course it comes with all sorts of conditions because there's restricted activity periods for when we can do certain things based on what the fish spawning habitats are, based on the temperature, based on sediment, all those sort of good things. And that's the world that, as a biologist, I live in. I need to make sure that you're not putting too much sediment in, you're not doing your activity when fish are trying to spawn. We want to leave them alone to do their business in the water there. My father-in-law's favorite things that he says, I don't drink water. He says, fish pee in it. Do a whole lot worse than that. But yeah, so the Water Act does not distinguish between our wetlands in the white area or the green area, and it prohibits anyone from draining, altering, or infilling wetlands on private or public land unless authorized to do so by the province through an approval under the provisions of the Act. And I know all of you are thinking it, so just someone go ahead and ask me.
Can you remind us what the difference is between white area and green area?
Yeah, I'll do that in a second. I'm sorry, it's the public land of the.
Oh, okay.
The private land of it's public land of the north and the private land in the south. I'll do that in a second. I apologize. I throw those terms around like everybody knows what I'm talking about. I'm sorry. And I know you're all thinking, but farmers drain wetlands every day. How come someone doesn't do something about that? Ask me at the end. So currently, what are we doing now with our focus on water and water management? Well, we're focusing on ecosystem health. We're focusing on watershed management, so managing within the capacity of basins. We've got the long-term comprehensive Water for Life strategy, and I've had the privilege of being on the Water Council, the Provincial Water Council, since it started up in 2004. So I represent the lake environment conservation sector on the Water Council. All of these programs are through partnerships where we emphasize stewardship. The province is investing in science. We want to understand aquatic ecosystems, and we are managing within the capacity of those specific watersheds. The South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, North Saskatchewan Regional Plans, those sort of things. The government's role now is more of a systems coordinator. So they're not the be-all, end-all, one-stop shop. The government's playing in the sandbox with everyone else. Where do we want to go? Well, we want to keep on going with cumulative effects. We want to keep on going with shared governance. And of course, this is all stuff from the province's website. You can look into this yourself. But more stakeholder engagement, not that old consultation, but engagement. Actually, not going out and telling people what we're going to do, but actually getting people to come in and share, have some of those shared ideas. We're investing in capacity building and integrated information sharing systems. We're trying to get more real-time data. And when I say we, I mean the province of Alberta. I'm an Albertan, so that's the we, not me. I work for the government. I don't. That's where the province wants to go. Full suites of regulatory and non-regulatory tools, and of course I've seen lots of real interesting things with our wetland policy. And at the end of the day, the government's role is to provide the assurance on the achievement of regulatory outcomes. You'll have heard that term a million times, which is one of the reasons why they wanted to create AMERA. That was a big failed experiment, because at the end of the day, the province can't just check box that everybody's doing okay. It's like having a bunch of fourth graders check their homework, right? When you let industry self-regulate. So the province does need to assure that their regulatory outcomes are being met. Threw this Sankey diagram in because I get this question a lot. How do we manage or how do we allocate our water anyway? And I was shocked. I think most people will be shocked to learn that the majority of our Water Act licenses are for surface water. It's completely different in the States where they actively mine their groundwater. They use way more groundwater than they do surface water. But not here in Alberta. We're still in our infancy in terms of moving all water around. Largely it's surface water. Largely it's those irrigation districts in the south, and largely the allocations are for agriculture to irrigate that desert in the south. Very little of it is actually for drinking water. Very little of it. So when we hear that we're water stressed, well, there's really some simple things that we can do to reallocate and get back to that wise use of water. Maybe we don't have so many hay crops to irrigate. Maybe we spend our money in different ways. So there's all sorts of decisions that need to be made on how we allocate our water. So there's lots of real interesting places to go. And this is a Sankey diagram that was done up by engineering student in 2011 or so. And you can Google that and find that. It's pretty slick. So municipalities and water, how does planning and water mix? And I get full engagement sometimes. Sometimes I get municipal councils that say, "Hey, Mr. White, thanks for coming. Thanks for your great presentation. Fabulous hair. Please get out of here. Municipalities don't regulate water. This is not our problem. The province regulates the water under the Water Act, and the feds regulate fish habitat under the Fisheries Act. So me as a municipal councillor, my municipality, I've got no role to play in water, in the management of water, right? But the Municipal Government Act does give broad powers to municipalities and the management of water on municipal lands, and municipalities make decisions about development which impacts wetlands, water bodies, and bodies of water. You guys play in that sandbox every day as planners. You make decisions about, well, we're going to zone this chunk of land commercial. And then, of course, when people come in to develop the land, they got to put in for a Water Act approval, and then they find out there's wetlands on it, and they can't develop it. And then they say, why the hell did you guys regulate this as, or zone this as commercial when we can't develop on it? So this is that bang, bang, bang that happens all the time. And the same thing with the province when they sell mineral rights on parcels of land in the green zone. Okay, go ahead and develop that oil and gas industry, and then oil and gas industry goes to get an approval for it, and it's like, well, no, you can't because you're on wetlands. Well, but the province sold us the rights to it. What do you mean we can't develop it? Also, municipalities are the owner of works and are liable. So Lac La Biche did a bad thing. Lac La Biche County did a bad thing recently, and they put in a sewage line through a wetland in the middle of wintertime and caused all sorts of sediment to go into the wetland. They didn't, their engineering company that they hired didn't finish the project properly, and they actually got a Water Act admin penalty, almost $12,000 in March of 2017. So yeah, municipality as the owner of works are going to be held liable under the Water Act for doing illegal things on their land, especially draining wetlands, impacting wetlands. This happens all the time. I mean, I could bring up the Government of Alberta enforcement page. Probably half of the enforcement orders are to municipalities. And a lot of it is around roadside, road work, building of roads. But a lot of it is just silly things like they didn't consider getting a Water Act approval because they figured, well, we're just another branch of government. We're not our problem, right? No, that's not the case. And I deal with a lot of these enforcement files all the time. Probably my most interesting one right now is with a farmer that straightened 1.5 kilometers of creek across his land. So it used to nice meander do this. No, laser straightened it right across his land. And we had to put the meander back in and the fish habitat back and all that good stuff. So the Municipal Government Act. Section 601 says, subject to any other enactment, a municipality has the direction, control, and management of the rivers, streams, watercourses, lakes, and other natural bodies of water within the municipality, including the airspace above and the ground below. That's some pretty broad powers. Under Section 664, municipal government can take the entirety of ravines, floodplains, or unstable ground as environmental reserve. Well, holy cow, wow. You can take the entirety of a floodplain as environmental reserve. Why aren't we doing that? That would solve all their flooding problems, wouldn't it? And we can have a fun debate about that after. Someone's going to want to skewer me for that one. But essentially, you want to take that buffer around any body of water, and that buffer is for two things. It's to allow access. The reason why we take ER, it's to allow public access and to prevent pollution. Now, all of you have got your copy of the MGA, right? You want to flip to the MGA and tell me how the MGA defines what a pollutant is.
Doesn't.
It doesn't! What? So, you heard my talk off the top. What are my big pollutants in Alberta? If I had to define what pollution is.
Phosphorus.
Sorry?
Phosphorus and sediment.
Yes. Yes. Phosphorus and sediment. Those are the big things that I want to focus on. So, if you're going to put a buffer around a body of water, it had better be able to deal with sediment and phosphorus. I'm not interested in atrazine or glyphosate or the traditional pesticides and those sort of things. I'm dealing with that non-point source pollution. So one of the big reports that the Water Council came out with in the last couple or 3 years said that the biggest water quality problems in this province are to do with non-point source pollution. And we actually had a non-point source pollution project team just to deal with that. Because the Water Act and all of the other federal legislation does the end-of-pipe stuff. We do a really great job with the end-of-pipe stuff. Like if any company wants to dump anything in any river, it's very heavily scrutinized. They've got to submit regular tests and samples and run models to make sure that my sewage pipe going into the North Saskatchewan River doesn't cause a huge fish kill 100 kilometers downstream. We do a good job with that stuff. Where we do a really poor job is on non-point source pollution. And I'm going to keep harping on phosphorus and sediment. So this is some water news, and you'll remember it's from 1894. But this seems to be news still in Alberta, and I caused a bit of excitement in Mackenzie Services folks recently in Peace River. But basically, I had two things to say. One of them was, you don't own the water that's on your land. Drop the mic. And the farmers just go wild. Well, you don't. No one owns the water that's on their land. The Water Act defines what water is, and I just said earlier about the water body, right? I can go pour this outside, and that becomes a water body. And the Water Act regulates and enforces on all this stuff. So I've already introduced this slide. Anybody that does anything that impacts water, that's deemed an activity under the Water Act. And any sort of an activity requires an approval by the director under the Water Act. And here's some land news, and of course from 1930, from the land transfer. You also don't own the land that's under that water. Drop the mic. So the Public Lands Act says that the title to the beds and shores of all permanent naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes is vested in the Crown of Alberta. Wicked. Now, I know that if my property butts up against Sylvan Lake, I know that that's the province's. I know that that's not mine. And there's nothing on my land title that says, you don't own the full 128 hectares or whatever. It's clear that, that I butt up against a lake and I don't own all that land. With wetlands, it becomes a whole lot more difficult. Because now I've got to figure out which of the wetlands are permanent and which of these wetlands are just water. Because the permanent wetlands, I also don't own the land that's under them. But of course, in all instances, I don't own any of the water. Right? All right. We're all good here. So the Crown owns the beds and shores of all permanent naturally occurring bodies of water, including wetlands in the white area, and all of the land in the green area, including its wetlands. So the Public Lands Act does differentiate wetlands into the white area and the green area. And I apologize, I promised to define my terms. So this is the white zone, green zone map that I keep talking about. And just to be super kind to everybody, I made the green zone green and the white zone white. Because one of these days, I'm going to flip them around just to screw with people. So we've got the provincial public lands, the green zone lands, and this is, all of these are allocated for forestry and peat development and all sorts of mining and harvesting and all sorts of other things. And we've got some parks, along here. We've got some other parks, but largely these are Crown-owned public lands and grazing reserves, don't forget those. And then the white zone is where we've got privately owned lands that we've given away, we gave away at the turn of the century, right? 75% of the land in that white area is owned privately. Of course, the rest of it is going to be parks, and we've got some federal land in here with First Nations reserves, federal parks, and of course, military bases. So when I talk about the white zone and the green zone, I'm talking about those lands. So without me having to do anything anywhere, all of the wetlands in the green zone are Crown-owned, we know that. But I have to go do an assessment in here to see if that water body is permanent naturally occurring or not. And that's where a wetland assessment comes into play. And that's where I spend a lot of my days these days, is doing these wetland assessments. So provincial watercourse and waterbody descriptions. Well, we've got two kinds of water in Alberta. Simply put, you've got running water and still water. So water courses, or running water, are defined by qualified aquatic environment specialists, or QASES, that deal with Water Act code of practice issues like fish habitat, turbidity, crossings, culverts, end-of-pipe stuff, all of that stuff. So QASES deal with flowing water. So you want a QASE person to deal with your flowing water issues, your fish habitat, all that good stuff. Still waters, water bodies, are defined by the wetland practitioners. And so we used to call those qualified wetland science practitioners. We used to call those qualified wetland aquatic environment specialists. But the province has gotten rid of all of those terms. And basically now anybody with 5 years experience with a professional organization in Alberta and 3 years experience dealing with wetlands can become an authenticating professional. And I noticed that the planners were at the front end of doing some of these changes with wetlands. So I'm sure as planners and being involved in your organization, you've seen all these changes for authenticating professionals under the Water Act for wetlands work, because all of us have a role to play. Biologists have a role, soil scientists have a role, engineers have a role, planners have a role. There's lots of different forestry folks have a role, so lots of different players in the wetland sandbox. So that's really interesting as well. And I like to have some fun with this. I'm still calling it Alberta's new 2013 wetland policy. Of course, it's been out for 5 years now, but we're still getting the regulations out behind it. So this whole, who can be a wetland authenticating professional, we're still sorting that out. The professional organizations are still sorting this stuff out. And same with the regulations behind the new wetland policy. We're still sorting that out as well. We're still seeing new reclamation guidelines. We're still seeing rules for peatland. We're still seeing new rules for gravel development, all sorts of things like that. So you can check out the wetland policy. And again, you can check out that white zone, green zone, and where the peatlands are in the northern part of the province. That peat map really fits the white zone, green zone map nicely. So we've got two kinds of wetlands in the province. You've got mineral wetlands, which are underlain by your typical regular soils. And then you've got our peat forming or organic wetlands in the north, the peatlands, the bogs and the fens. And our new policy goal is to conserve, restore, protect, and manage Alberta's wetlands to sustain the benefits that they provide to the environment, society, and the economy. That is our new wetland policy. That's the gist of it. Our old wetland policy used to say no net loss. But we were doing such a poor job with no net loss that we couldn't even give lip service to that anymore. And so we had to come up with a whole new way of managing our wetlands. And we know it can't be on a focus on expanding the number of acres of wetlands that we have. That was Ducks Unlimited's hill to die on. And they couldn't do it. We couldn't do it anymore in Alberta. We ran out of land. So now we're looking at wetlands with a whole different lens. We're looking at the value of wetlands. We recognize that some wetlands are higher value than other ones. And so we're looking at the benefits that they provide. And now we've got a brand new valuation approach. And we've got much more rigor around avoidance. How hard did you try to avoid that wetland, Mr. Developer? Can you build that road around the wetland, Mr. Developer? Oh, can you build that road around that highly valuable wetland, Mr. Developer? Because this is a very highly valued wetland. So our goal, planners, society in general, is to understand now what is the value of a wetland. We all need to be good at valuing ecosystem goods and services. Well, not too surprisingly, just yesterday, I saw an article in the Journal of Wetlands that said that school teachers across, this is in Europe, but school teachers have no concept or don't understand wetlands at all, and so they're completely unable to get value of wetlands across to students in schools. Well, if we can't do that, how can, if the public, this is all predicated on the public's ability to be able to value wetlands, and we miserably fail there. So one of the challenges I'm going to leave with this group is, of course, no one's doing education anymore. Very few organizations are doing environmental education anymore. Whose job is this supposed to be? Of course, we've got some brand new enforcement staff too. So in the last year in this province, I think there were 6 new wetlands enforcement staff that the province has hired to just deal with wetland infractions. AER has hired some wetlands enforcement people as well. So we're starting to see some rigor around enforcement of damages to wetlands as well. The last time you folks saw me, we were talking about stepping back. So I gave a presentation in October in 2016 on the stepping back document, so a beneficial management practices guide for new development near water bodies in Alberta's settled region. And I did that with Judy Stewart. And this basically gives some guidance to municipalities on how big of an environmental reserve should we be taking, because the MGA again says thou shalt take a minimum 6-meter buffer, but it doesn't say how much we should take, right? So it's a minimum 6-meter buffer, and of course my story, a buffer across a creek that you can jump across and a lake the size of Lac La Biche, that's not going to fly. So how much should we be taking? I'll leave that with you. What are the impacts of ALSA and the SSRP? So we've got this brand new land use framework, and we've got all of these regional plans and these management frameworks, and this is all the space that we all work in together. You as planners, myself as biologists, and doing modeling and all that kind of work. Not runway modeling, I know what you're thinking. Not that kind of modeling, the water flows monitoring, that kind of stuff. I always get them confused too. In 2016, water resources are to be managed at a watershed scale and in an integrated manner based on our cumulative effects management approach. And that is all really well spelled out in the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. South Saskatchewan Regional Plan has all sorts of language around phosphorus management. Phosphorus management plans. Yes. Right? Yes. We're finally getting there. If we really wrapped our heads around sediment as well, I'd be a whole lot happier. Our construction industry needs a bonk upside the head for sediment. Our transportation industry needs to get woken up to the impacts of sediment, especially in road building and culverts. We're not doing a good job with sediment management, but we're starting to get there with phosphorus. I'm really excited about that. Of course, why we want to have good riparian areas, and the same reason why we want to have good wetlands, is to make sure that we're having that sediment and phosphorus management. And we want to have appropriate setbacks from water bodies to maintain water quality, floodwater conveyance and storage, bank stability, and habitat. This is from the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan. This is what people are spending their days doing. I know people, this is all they do. I know folks from the Bow River Basin Council, this is what they're spending their time doing. It's exciting. These are really exciting times for someone like myself, because we've finally woken up to the value of phosphorus, the sediment, and having good water quality and how we're going to get there, and managing within the limitations of the basin. So we've got these socioeconomic benefits, we've got flood conveyance and storage, you've got bank and shoreline stabilization, habitat and biodiversity, water quality. These are all of the same ecological goods and services that wetlands provide, because riparian areas just are wetlands. That's all they are. And just for fun, I'll throw this out, because I like to talk about, when I used to give presentations to a lot of lake associations, they always ask me, well, who's who in the zoo? Who owns what? And it shakes out like this. So the Crown owns the water, as we all know. 1894. And the Crown also owns the land under all permanent naturally occurring bodies of water, 1930. The feds manage the fish habitat, wherever that is in the lake, and I'd have to map that. The province regulates the fish and the management of the fish themselves. Then you've got this other landowner at the edge of the shore here, at the top of the bank. You've got private landowners, but wherever a multi-lot subdivision has gone in and an environmental reserve has been taken, you've got another landowner here, which is the municipality. This is their environmental reserve that they've taken, and now that they own and manage to allow for public access and to prevent pollution. This is that 6-meter minimum buffer. So you've got an awful lot of different players here. And then there's different departments that deal with this. This is managed by public lands. This is managed by Water Act and water folks. The fish habitat is managed by the feds under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Different pollution into this water body is going to trigger different assessments, federal and provincial. So there's all sorts of interesting things that go on at this nexus of the edge of the water. Some of the classic things that I've heard of in the past is somebody who wanted to create a beach on their property, and so they dumped a bunch of sand here on the public land because the mayor of the summer village said it was okay to do so. Nobody went to jail. I'm running a little long, so I'm probably going to skip over this unless I get some specific questions about the floodway, flood fringe, where you can develop, where you can't develop. And I want to end on this. I love this. You've got hard infrastructure in water, and then you've got a degraded riparian area, and you've got high floodwaters. Where are we going to see some damage? Exactly where you'd expect. And I didn't even need to look at the slide to see which way the water flowed here. But anytime you've got hard infrastructure, and this is when I toured Calgary after the big floods in 2013, most of the damage around Princess Island were right where we had engineered hard structures in the water. Because we force water into land that's already been degraded. So there's no trees here, deep binding roots. No, grass. Grass with roots that are that deep. Zero ability to protect and buffer this area from a high flood, high damage, high water, fast-moving watercourse has power. It's going to tear your banks apart. And this is where we're going to have all of our infrastructure trouble. Can we do this a bit better? I think so. So back to where I started. Under climate change, the rules have changed. Water management in Alberta is still on managing for drought and floods. We've got all sorts of different pieces of legislation now and different ways of thinking under the Land Stewardship Act, the MGA, regional plans, our WRR programs that we've got in the province. We've got Bill 27 has affected the way we do things. We've got this new thinking from the Netherlands, like Room for the River. But you're still dealing with the taking of environmental reserves. We're still dealing with biophysical impact assessments. And of course, we're still dealing with subdivision appeal board and how all that works. What can Aquality do for you? We do biophysical impact assessments. We do all that regulatory work. We do lots of wetland training. As a matter of fact, I'm doing a couple of wetlands courses coming up here in February in Edmonton and February again in Calgary. So if you want to know more about wetlands or how we figure out what the land part is and how we do compensation and all that good stuff, I teach a 2-day course on that because I just enjoy doing it because it's a whole lot of fun. Lots of other water resources that you can find on the web, and it was, like I say, it was really fun researching this presentation. It took me to some new places that I hadn't been to or hadn't been to in a while. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Jay. Once again, you have delivered incredibly on a most engaging and interesting presentation. I think we just have a few minutes left in case anybody has any questions from the floor.
Yes.
Regarding the flood fringe, is the province actually moving in the direction where they're restricting saying absolutely no development in the flood fringe?
So, this is what we're supposed to be doing. I had anticipated that question. So this is what we're supposed to be doing, is eliminating any development at all in the floodway and allowing only flood-proofed buildings in the flood fringe. So that's all what we're supposed to be doing. So we have a big giant fire in Fort McMurray, and they built right back on the flood fringe.
Yeah, I heard that.
So yes,
Isn't there 2 municipalities that are exempt from?
there are.
Okay.
Yes,
I just didn't know if that had changed.
yes, no, there are. Drumhill or Buffalo are exempt. That's right. Yeah.
Doesn't make it smart.
No, but to be fair, the province did decommission an entire neighborhood in High River and put it back to floodplain. Bought out all the lands, and I remember them selling the houses. They had a big auction selling off those houses. Sorry?
Isn't it Wallaceville?
Wallaceville, that's right, yep. So that's all been renaturalized and put back to river. So that's super progressive. I was very encouraged by that.
That'll be a little difficult to do for downtown Fort Mac.
Yep.
And Drumhill.
All of their development's been on a floodway and floodplain. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of real interesting stuff on that. There's a spreadsheet, flood choices for Albertans, and really decent flood mapping that the province is, I believe they're supposed to do every major urban center in the province. I don't know where that gets us, but I have to refer to this regularly to see how much progress they've made in different areas. And basically it shows the no-go, the go, no-go areas. Red is the floodway, and the lighter red is the flood fringe. So it tells you at a glance where you can and can't develop. Yes?
I believe I have time for 2 more questions. That one first and the
Sorry.
second.
With some of the recent changes to the MGA, can the municipality now confidently take a wetland ZR through the subdivision process?
No.
Whoa! I'm so afraid to jump on that grenade. I would say yes, but I will defer to the experts in the room.
Or the next presentation.
Or we can explore the next presentation. Does anybody else want to?
Yeah, there was, back in the 70s and 80s, there was sort of a major initiative to map floodways and flood fringes.
Yeah.
And we've incorporated a number of municipalities to incorporate those into zoning bylaws or other regulatory tools. But they seem to have fallen short. And they were fairly rigorously adhered to. So I was a little curious as to whether, well, floods have changed, presumably. The risk has changed. The risk has increased. So hence the need to redo this. But we still rely on these in a number of municipalities I'm aware of.
I don't know enough about how engineers do flood mapping, and I'm not an engineer. I haven't been able to look into the black box of how those are, because my understanding is different engineers can do them different ways and do different risk assessments on those return periods.
The rule of thumb was the boundary between the flood fringe, floodway and the flood fringe was depth and velocity.
Right.
A meter of water, a meter
Per second. Yeah, meter cube per second.
That was sort of the rule of thumb that was applied. And I'm not sure whether that's been re-examined or whether the new mapping is rethinking those criteria or not.
That is a good question. I'd love to learn more about that too. I have heard from lots of people they are inadequate, and of course I've heard that climate change, of course, blows those models away as well, because now all your water timing and flows have all changed, because you're getting smaller bursts of more intense flows, which would blow those old models away.